Dong Yuan's The Summer Landscape by Shanghai People's Publication House in 1959. Mr. Li Yanshan, a renowned painter and art connoisseur of Chinese paintings, remarked in his diary, "Shanghai's recent publication of Dong Yuan's The Summer Landscape looks identical to the one in my collection. I wondered if they are both replica by ancient painters. While both versions share strong resemblance to each other in terms of dimensions, content and overall composition, high-resolution images have revealed important differences between them." The modernist master, Mies van der Rohe, has a famous dictum regarding design: God is in the details. Let's begin zooming into the differences between the two scrolls. We shall begin with the upper right corner of the scrolls. In X, the two mountain ranges at the back are portrayed with a simple wash, complemented with a few light strokes. Strokes over wash are much more obvious in Y. In X, strokes express the volume of the ranges, and points of various shapes, sizes and shades delineate the vegetation in a palpable rhythm. Strokes are sparsely used here in Y. The volume of the ranges are mainly defined by points. Distant trees are depicted with simple combinations of horizontal and vertical points. Undulation of the back and front ridges echo with each other. All these compositional arrangements are missing in Y. The painter of X obviously did a more convincing portrait of a hazy scenery. The massing of the mountain is rendered consistently round and smooth in X, unlike Y, where a flat top with a sharp angle appears unexpectedly. Points help to enliven the intertwining course of the valleys. However, points in Y are comparatively offbeat and loose. Trees at the foot of the hill are painted with much clearer and more confident strokes in X than in Y. This extensive misty layer can be considered as the focus of the entire scroll. It is also a classic example of a Chinese painting technique called liu, by which means leaving a blank space. At the foot of this massive and complex-looking mountain, an extension with a simple triangular shape appears. It is there to complete the picture of the mountain embracing the misty layer. The lopsidedness of the hill is the exact opposite to that of the misty layer. They together form an interesting visual balance. Simply through the application of points with various sizes, shapes, densities and shades, X has created a sense of volume and spatial distance. Meanwhile, the painter of Y lacks the finesse, resulting in a relatively flat-looking mountain with sporadic points. A sense of haziness is very much alive in X. Obscured glimpses of the trees are painted exquisitely. The transition between the wash and the blank space is too sudden in Y, which diminishes the sense of haziness. Attention was given to the most minute details in X. Birds flying at a higher altitude look sharper, because they are already above the mist. Those still amidst the cloud look dimmer. All birds are basically painted with the same shade in Y. In other words, the journey of those birds soaring through the mist is ignored. In X, the bottom of the misty layer is relatively flat and in high contrast with the surrounding, which has created a visual tension that gives us a sense that the misty layer is drifting forward. Meanwhile, Y has no such visual impact. Here we see the misty layer meanders, and tapers off in an artistic manner, while the misty layer in Y ends in a rather unimaginative fashion. There is another thin layer of mist, painted subtly but clearly in X, which has basically disappeared in Y. A thin and vital curve in X links up the slope of the hills on both sides. It also defines the spatial distance from the range behind. Similar linkage, if any, is not obvious in Y, which causes spatial ambiguity among the ranges. The painter of X shows us again how to portray a convincing misty layer embraced among the ranges. These meticulous addition of short and slightly curved strokes, as well as these slightly curved parallel lines, are an endeavor to represent different textures of the sedimentary landscape. However, all these details cannot be found in Y. What a breathtaking view of undulating ranges amidst a sea of clouds. The mist has sculpted the ranges in X to look like a phoenix spreading its wings. The mist in Y, on the other hand, is not exercising its creative power. The 3D effect comes from a disciplined application of strokes and points that follow the direction of the slopes. The sporadic strokes and points have flattened the ranges in Y. There are a few farmhouses at the foot of the mountain. The biggest farmhouse in X has its fence, while most of the houses cannot even be recognized in Y. Big chunk of sedimentary rock can be tilted due to crustal movement. This geological feature is represented with slanted parallel strokes in X. One can even see the shadow on water casted by this tilted rock. It is a rather confusing image we have here in Y. One can hardly decipher the boundary between this small island and its surrounding water. A few sheds can be found on this narrow strip of land. Two men standing in the water are perhaps extending their fishing net. All these details are rather vague in Y. A lady with a drooping rose hairstyle is having a conversation with the punting boatman. Notice that in Y, the pole entered into the water from the back of the boatman, which is extremely awkward. Just to mention that all human figures in X are not colored, unlike those in Y. A group of men are heading towards the farmhouses. 3 of them are missing in Y, after the patchwork. The man in front is holding his backpack with his left hand, and pointing in the direction of the farmhouses with his right hand. He turned his head towards his companions as if he is the leader of the group. Notice the difference in these short curves. In Y, they are painted like tall grasses. In X, they are more flat, horizontal and stack up, which is probably a representation of a shale landscape. the short scattered hemp strokes is much more refined in X. One can see links between the island and rocks during low tide in the morning hours. These details are absent in Y, instead we see a bunch of unnecessary points. Leaves are painted mainly with points. Points are painted in sharp contrast in X, while those in Y are rather monotonous. That is why trees look relatively compressed and flat in Y. The owl tail on one side of the rooftop has perhaps faded away in Y. Also, 3 columns are not connected to the underneath of the roof. 2 boat passengers have been left out, perhaps due to careless restoration. There are actually 2 persons at the back seat of the boat in X. In Y, however, we see an adult instead. The 2 front passengers are very likely to be ladies with a fall-off-a-horse hairstyle. The fashion of this lady also resembles the image on the left. The long scattered hemp strokes are obviously applied with more confidence in X than in Y. Trees that are growing on the edge of the stiff slope are grasping onto the thinning soil. Unfortunately, these details are muddled through in Y. X again surpasses Y in the execution of points, in the aspects of distribution, and variations in shapes, sizes and shades. The farmhouse resident welcomes his visitor. There are a few plots of farmland or fish pond nearby. These details are rather impossible to be recognized from Y. We learn from Y that there should be 2 shepherd boys. These white goats and the trace of water on the wetland are painted with the leaving a blank space technique. X again surpasses Y in the outcome. The contrast between the shades of the bamboo trees and that of the rock in X is well controlled, while the bamboo trees in Y look rather hard and flashy. Here we have some details on the wetland. In X, we can imagine seeing reflection of the vegetation and that of the light on the water surface. The details in Y are not quite as refined as to inspire the viewer's imagination. The hill in X keeps its consistently smooth and round profile, while that in Y looks relatively flat, especially on the peak. A few bamboo trees have enhanced the exquisiteness of the hilltop property. The bamboo trees in X are painted with simple and elegant strokes with a slightly lighter shade. Bamboo trees in Y cannot keep its forms together. The notches and fault lines of the sedimentary rock are much better rendered in X than in Y. Here in X, trees stand out sharper than its surrounding, and thus has created a shallow depth of field effect in this part of the scroll. The effect of shallow depth of field is not as obvious in Y. again demonstrates how to portray convincing geological features of sedimentary rocks with well-controlled strokes and shades. We see two pairs of travelers, one on the bridge and one on the edge of the cliff. Let's start with the pair on the edge of the cliff. The one on the left is looking at his companion. This man is facing us with his back at an angle, hence, he is most likely looking down. The upper and lower body of this man are twisted at a different angle. Anyway, he is looking straight towards his companion. The man on the left is looking up, while his companion turns back to look at him. The figure on the right is rather indistinct, looks to be back-facing with his head turning to his left. His friend is looking straight ahead. As such, these four men in X are engaged in a very different interaction from those in Y. There is no interaction between the two groups in Y. In X, the scenario is probably as follows: the man on the left side up high saw the man on the right side on the bridge, then turned to inform their companion, and there we have one looking up and the other looking down to greet their friends. The most obvious difference here between the two scrolls is the posture of the pine trees. These pine trees are losing their needles in summer, not a very healthy sign. Logically, their roots may also be unhealthy. Trees incline due to weak root system is a very realistic and natural phenomenon. Another scroll also titled Dong Yuan's The Summer Landscape with similar content and dimension was shown in Sotheby's 2012 autumn auction. During the rule of Emperor Song Huizong, an important painting is said to have nearly 100 replica. Other than these three scrolls, who knows if there are more similar scrolls hidden somewhere in the world. However, we know that there must be an original to be copied from in the first place. The truth is, one rarely finds, if any at all, a replica that surpasses the original.